Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has expressed a desire for a total cessation of hostilities, leading many to ask, is Iran finally exhausted? The answer is a resounding no. If the United States expects to find an Iran begging for a premature end to the conflict, President Trump and his administration will receive nothing but a cold shoulder and a bitter dose of disappointment. All expectations for a short-term intermediary solution are fading like the late afternoon sun, as Iran confirms it is not seeking a mere temporary ceasefire with the United States and Israel. Tehran's stance is crystalline. They demand a complete and permanent termination of this war rather than deceptive, delaying agreements in which they no longer place any shred of trust. Yet everything seems to have hit a dead end once again. On March 18th, an Iranian production facility at the South Pass gas field was struck. This is not just any industrial site. South Pass is the largest gas field in the world and serves as Iran's most critical domestic energy artery. Israeli media outlets suggest the strike was a surgical operation carried out by Israel with the explicit consent of the United States, though Tel Aviv has not immediately claimed formal responsibility. Previously, Washington and Tel Aviv had avoided targeting Iran's energy production facilities in the Persian Gulf to prevent spillover retaliation against the oil and gas industries of neighboring Arab nations. This attack, however, has ignited Tehran's fury, triggering retaliatory strikes against major energy hubs in the Gulf. This escalation has sent oil prices into a vertical climb, prompting President Donald Trump to threaten to blow South Pass off the map if Iran does not cease its counter-offensives. To understand the gravity of the situation, one must look at the geography. South Pass is part of the world's largest natural gas reserve. Iran shares this offshore field in the Persian Gulf with Qatar, which refers to its portion as the North Dome. It is therefore not difficult to understand why the Iranian foreign minister has reacted with such visceral hostility. Another highly controversial point in Araghchi's argument is his explanation regarding the casualties in neighboring urban areas. Araghchi firmly asserts that the blame does not lie with Tehran but squarely with Washington. According to his analysis, the US military's decision to move forces out of traditional, isolated military bases and into luxury hotels in the heart of civilian cities has effectively transformed these residential zones into unintended military targets. Iran maintains that they only aim at US military entities and is the human shield tactic of the adversary that has plunged the region into its current state of absolute chaos. Regarding the global economic Achilles heel, the Strait of Hormuz, Tehran appears to be preparing for a new post-war order. Araghchi has proposed the design of entirely new agreements and regulations for transit through the strait. The stated goal is to ensure peaceful navigation under clearer, more rigid rules. However, this indicates that Iran is not just fighting a kinetic war, it is calculating a strategic redefinition of control over this vital global waterway, a move that will undoubtedly send shockwaves through the halls of maritime powers worldwide. Despite Israel's brutal decapitation campaign targeting high-ranking leaders like Ali Larijani and even the reported assassination of the supreme leader in the early days of the conflict, the Iranian side continues to display an incredible, perhaps defiant, confidence in its political structure. The foreign minister asserts that the US and Israel are making a fatal mistake by believing that removing specific individuals will cause the system to implode. According to him, the Islamic Republic is built on an exceptionally stable political, economic, and social institutional foundation. The presence or absence of any single person, whether the supreme leader or the foreign minister, cannot stop the machinery of state, as there is always an immediate successor ready to take the mantle. However, the perspective from the opposing side paints a radically different picture. Israeli intelligence officials argue that these precision liquidations are in fact sowing unprecedented chaos within Tehran's leadership circles. According to assessments from Tel Aviv, Iran is suffering losses many times greater than in any previous conflict and is genuinely struggling to formulate cohesive strategic decisions. They believe the absence of architects like Larijani has left irreparable voids, causing Iran's policy-making process to fall into a state of localized paralysis. Yet the US and Israel have arguably made the situation far worse. To visualize the sheer scale of the problem, we must recognize that South Pass is more than a gas field. It contains approximately 51 trillion cubic meters of gas, a figure sufficient to light and heat the entire planet for 13 years. For Iran's domestic stability, this is the nation's only energy lung, providing up to 70% of the national gas output. Preliminary reports suggest that the latest strikes have vaporized nearly 12% of the field's total production capacity. This is not just a statistic on a spreadsheet. It means millions of Iranian civilians are facing widespread blackouts and a critical lack of heating in the middle of a brutal winter and an even more brutal war. The drama reached a breaking point when Arab nations, which had previously maintained a cautious neutrality, finally spoke out in the harshest terms. The UAE labeled the strikes a grave escalation, while Qatar did not hesitate to criticize the attack on South Pass as a dangerous and irresponsible act that directly threatens global energy security. But Tehran did not sit idly by. Almost immediately, Iranian armed forces materialized their threats with devastating retaliatory strikes on the energy centers of their neighbors. The industrial city of Ras Laffan in Qatar, home to the world's largest LNG production facility, accounting for 20% of the global supply, was rocked by massive explosions and suffered severe structural damage. In Saudi Arabia, 2 refineries near the capital, Riyadh, were engulfed in flames, prompting the kingdom to declare that it reserves the right to take military action in response. President Donald Trump added fuel to the fire by threatening to completely destroy Iran's entire gas infrastructure if Tehran dared to touch any more facilities belonging to American partners in Qatar. Although Washington claims it had no prior knowledge of the Israeli strike on South Pass, the rhetoric coming from the White House suggests the US is ready for a massive military intervention scenario to protect its energy interests. The immediate consequence of this spiral of violence is the terrifying volatility of the financial markets. On the morning of March 19th, Brent crude oil prices surged past $113 per barrel, while natural gas prices in Europe skyrocketed by 6% in a single day. Analysts warn that while disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz might cause delays measured in months, the physical destruction of production facilities like South Pass or Ras Laffan will leave scars that last decades. Looking back at the 2003 Iraq War or the recent conflict in Ukraine, the recovery of energy infrastructure is always a multi-billion-dollar process that takes years due to the breakdown of specialized equipment supply chains. Qatar has ordered the Iranian military attaché to leave the country within 24 hours, while the UAE has been forced to shut down major gas facilities like Habshan due to fears of stray missiles. Every missing barrel of crude oil right now not only drives up gas prices in the US, placing extreme political pressure on the Trump administration, but also directly delays the recovery of the global economy after the war. Furthermore, President Trump has begun to mention the nuclear option. The US believes that Tehran is now only a short distance away from a nuclear weapon, potentially capable of activating them within hours or days. It is this obsession with an apocalyptic scenario targeting Israel and the US that has pushed Washington to consider a mission without precedent, deploying ground troops directly into the mountains of Isfahan to seize or destroy the entire stockpile of weapons-grade nuclear material. If activated, this would be the boldest and riskiest military operation in modern history, far exceeding the scope of the raid that neutralized bin Laden. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has even hinted that there may be no choice but to order special forces to raid and take the material. Despite warnings of a grueling ground war of attrition, the American leader remains decisive, asserting that he fears nothing. However, nuclear experts at Harvard worry that if the US stops now, it will only leave behind a weakened but vengeful Iranian regime, more determined than ever to possess the bomb, especially since they retain the core knowledge and essential hardware. Nevertheless, skepticism remains regarding the breakout time figures provided by the White House. Some suggest that the US is exaggerating the speed of the adversary, to create a pretext for an all-out offensive. In reality, before the campaign began in late February, several top intelligence officials, including the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, chose to resign, believing the threat from Iran was not as urgent as the propaganda suggested. Every war must eventually end at a negotiating table, but in a context where both sides are drawing their swords and lack any true diplomatic exit ramps, the world is holding its breath to see if a raid on Isfahan will truly manifest, opening a new and bloodier chapter in the Middle East.